things just a hair slower without my colleague. But I'm delighted that you all could join us, and I think you're in for a really interesting session. This is our penultimate session in our Seasons of Responsibility Interreligious Conversations on Environmental Justice and Repair series. I'm so grateful to our partners at the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue for helping shape this series. Seasons of Responsibility was designed to reflect this particular time of year as the seasons transition from winter to spring. And there's a whole range of holidays in many different religious traditions that kind of signify these changes, these transitions. I feel like I'm reporting today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where it is very firmly in the winter camp, but I know there are people out there that it's 89 degrees in Palo Alto today. And so we're all in this place where the weather is questionable and timeliness is also upon us. So I wanted to have a moment to explore this kind of porous backwards and forwards winter spring within the Jewish and actually the Persian and the Muslim calendar. We are exploring today the start of the Jewish calendar, the beginning, the Persian New Year, and the close of Ramadan. And each of these moments invites reflections on renewal, accountability, and how we live with the earth and one another. My colleagues today, Hussein, Rashid, and Gordon Tucker, will speak a little bit more on this, but I do want to say that the war in Iran is now entering its third week. It weighs heavily on many of our communities across the world. As I said, our speakers will open by addressing this, but I want to name it at the outset. And in times like these, when violence, uncertainty, and grief feel close, it can be difficult to gather for reflection. So I appreciate that you all made the time to join us today. Today's conversation is going to focus on land and overconsumption, questions that sit at the intersection of spirituality, ethics, and the physical world we inhabit. Our traditions remind us that land is not simply a resource, but a trust, and our responsibility to it is both practical and moral. So Hussein, Rashid, and Gordon Tucker, who I'll introduce in a little while, will offer the reflections and bring us into conversation with some text from both Jewish and Muslim traditions. I want to thank our sponsors today, Temple Israel of Albany, for their Chacham level sponsorship. Thanks to everyone who made a donation to support the series. It's so important in making JTS learning available and accessible to broad communities. If you're interested in sponsorship information, I'll be posting some information about that in the chat. Now, let's get to today's session. Our session today is called Relationships and Commitment, Land Beyond Ownership. And we're joined by two speakers, Hussein Rashid, who is a PhD and a free-range academic, which I love that title. He's currently affiliated with Union Theological Seminary. He's a board member of the Interfaith Center of New York, and he specializes in working on Muslims in U.S. popular culture and Shia theologies of justice. He's also a producer of the PBS digital series, American Muslim Stories, and the award-winning New York Times op doc, The Secret of Muslims in the U.S. Rabbi Gordon Tucker is the Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement at JTS. He focuses on enhancing Jewish life at the seminary, and he enriches our study of Judaism with joy and deep understanding that only lived experience can bring. In addition to his lengthy JTS tenure, he was a pulpit rabbi and has numerous writing credits to his name. He's a leading scholar and interpreter of Conservative Judaism, and he also articulates the enduring power of JTS's compelling approach to Jewish law and Jewish life. There's going to be time for questions. You can send your questions to me. And for technical questions, those should also come to me. I'll be sharing our sources on the screen today, but if you'd like to have them on your screen, I'm going to put that information in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gordon and to Hussein.
Hey, thank you, Ellie. And as Ellie noted, we have our dialogue today that we're looking forward to. It's on a particular subject, but before we begin it, we must not fail to acknowledge the wars that are being waged now, wars because of so many fronts, and the suffering on various levels that it's bringing in its wake to innocents. We will be speaking today about human overreaching that causes abuse of the earth and abuse of its land, and how that in turn relates to the various abuses that afflict the innocent vulnerable in society. So in that respect, our topic does relate to the wars, inasmuch as conflicts inevitably bring with them various exploitations and degradations of the earth and of its inhabitants.
We also want to acknowledge the eliminationist rhetoric targeting Muslims coming from centers of powers in the US and the physical attacks against Jewish communities in the same week. We stand with each other in rejecting both of these hatreds, our communities as targets of bigotry. We also affirm what both of our traditions teach. Whosoever takes a life, they've killed all of humanity, and whosoever saves a life, it's as if they've saved all of humanity. I'm sorry that we have to begin with such statements in this day and age in 2026, but it's also important to recognize where we are, as Gordon said. And I also want to thank JTS, Ali, and Gordon for hosting me and inviting me to this conversation.
Okay. So I will begin, if I may. So this year, as Ramadan is about to end later this week with the new moon, the first month of the Jewish year, Nisan, will begin with that same new moon. It's known as the month of redemption, since the first redemption, the release from Egyptian slavery, happened in this month at the Passover full moon. I think it's important for understanding the texts that both Hussein and I will be referring to today to point out a critical aspect of the Jewish telling of the story of the Exodus. That retelling can and does happen on many occasions, but obviously none as intensely focused as it is at the Seder on the first night of Passover. And here's the critical aspect of that narrative. That Passover narrative begins with the phrase, "We were once slaves." The Hebrew word is avadim, a cognate clearly of abid in Arabic. We were slaves to Pharaoh, but now God has brought us near to serve, avod, same root, to serve God. In fact, the triumphant ending of that whole narrative consists of the recitation of Psalm 113, which begins with the words, "O servants of the Lord, praise the Lord's name." In other words, the Jewish understanding of the Festival of Freedom is not a release from all servitude. It's a transition from the debasing form of servitude, oftentimes slavery, to human tyrants, the transition to the noble form of servitude, which is service to God. Or as Leviticus 25, a text that we will look at in more depth later, puts it, "It is to me, God, that the Israelites are servants," to which the later rabbis added this gloss, "and they are not to be servants to servants." So this is what we are bidden to turn our thoughts to as the new cycle of the year and its sacred days begins for Jews with each spring new moon. What I think both Hussein and I will be highlighting today is that nobility of the right kind of servitude. Not to be masters of the universe, to use Tom Wolfe's memorable phrase, but rather to serve in humility without overreaching, and to serve God means to serve God's people, especially the most vulnerable among them. And so much of this is echoed in the main text that I think Hussein will be bringing to us today. So, Hussein, I turn to you for whatever preliminary remarks you want to make.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. That was a lovely introduction, actually, I think, tying both our texts together. As Ali mentioned, we are at a point where we are coming to the end of Ramadan. This Friday, inshallah, will be Eid for Ramadan. And Saturday, is Nowruz, New Day, the Persian New Year, which is also incredibly important with certain Shi'i traditions, including my own. And these are normally festive times. But they're also coming at periods of deep reflection and practical considerations for what is happening in the world that is allowing us to think about what our commitments are. And when we first started having these conversations 2-3 months ago, the letter that I'm choosing is a letter for the first Shi'i Imam, Imam Ali, to a man he's appointed as governor of Egypt, a man named Malik al-Ashtar. This is a very well-known letter within Muslim traditions. It's known amongst people who do poli-sci. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General, held it up as one of the models of great governance in world history. And it was an attempt to think about one of the sections is thinking about how do you think about land tax? How do you extract from the land so that it is helpful both to the people who are working the land, but also to the society, the civilization, the community to whom the people who work the land belong to, right? So this relationship between the land, the people who work the land, and the greater community. So thinking about this as various levels of society. And as Gordon correctly pointed out, it is in the context, the letter is in the context of what do we owe not only one another, but what do we owe one another because of what we owe to God. So the language of bondage, of engagement, of slavery is the same. The root in Arabic is the same, a cognate with abidah. It's called abidah, but it has uh, the the way one of the words is used, or one of the formations of the root, is how Muslims talk about worship, which is ibadat, which is to tie yourself to God. And I think this framing of who um, is enslaved and who do you bond yourself to are two very different questions. And it's a reminder to us, I think, in framing that, what are we bound to questions of capital, which is what I think some of this letter is getting to? Are we bound to questions of capital and production, or are we bound to a greater ethic, what is called in this letter esan, or virtue or beauty, that ties us to a relationship to God's creation and to God, because we are bound to God rather than enslaved by notions of production and capital. And so for me, there's a deep, deep resonance in the sets of texts that we're talking about today.
Good. Thank you. So I mentioned Leviticus 25. I want to say a few things about it, and take a few little peeks at it, and I'll come back to it a little bit later to try to look at the entire arc of the chapter. But this is a chapter that stands near the exact center of the Pentateuch. And in my opinion, not only in mine, it's perhaps one of the most important and consequential chapters in the entire Torah. So, as I said, let's look at a few of those far-reaching clauses in the chapter, and then subsequently we'll try to see what the overall arc of the chapter is telling us. So, Ellie, if you could put Leviticus 25 up, we'll look at verses 5 and 6. I don't know, are you able to make this a little bit larger for people
I'll
to
try. I'll see what I
see
can
it
do.
better? Yeah.
You keep talking. I'll get
Okay.
and I'll do my best here.
All right. First, verse 5, which is, yes, in the middle of talking about what happens every seventh year, what's called the sabbatical year. So it's right at the top there. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. So you are being reminded every 7 years that you are not the ultimate owner of the land, that you are entrusted with it, but periodically you have to relinquish the ownership rights. It's a temporary relinquishing because you're going to be back in charge of it in the 8th year. We'll get to what the terminus ad quem is for that in a little bit. But you're reminded that you are entrusted with it. You relinquish the ownership rights. You open the land to everyone. You may eat, just like them, whatever grows in that land, but you may not gather it in, and you may not store produce. And this actually connects to what was so interesting for me to see that in the Imam Ali's letter that Hussein is bringing to us, there is a strict prohibition on hoarding that the letter emphasizes, which is so resonant with what we find here. It's important that there is every 7 years a radical equality, even with the beasts of the field. They have no fewer rights than the so-called owner of the land has for that entire year. And now if you just scroll down a little bit more to verses 13 and following, we're in the Jubilee year now. This is year 50. And if the sabbatical year was a symbolic and temporary relinquishing of ownership, the Jubilee now constitutes a very concrete and final surrender of ownership. And in that year of the Jubilee, each of you shall return to your holding. And therefore, when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, do not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, you shall be charged only for the remaining crop years. That is, when you sell or buy land, you are not really buying the land itself. What you are buying is the produce of crop years remaining until the arrival of the Jubilee, when we have this repatriation. This, of course, makes it impossible for there to be a generations long development of an underclass in the society. And the land is central in this. Later on in the chapter, we don't have to scroll to it. I think you can take this down for now. It will say, "The land is mine," in God's voice. "You are but strangers resident with me." Tenancy on the land is established, and as is true of every tenant who has ever rented an apartment in New York City or elsewhere, you have a lot of responsibilities to the ultimate owner, and you better leave it in a good condition. For they are my servants, it says at the end of the chapter, "whom I freed from the land of Egypt." They are my servants. I didn't make them totally free. I brought them into this nobility of serving God, and they may not give themselves over into servitude. So these are some of the high points of that, and I'm gonna pause here and turn it back to my partner and let him begin to explicate his material.
Yeah, actually, Gordon, before I turn to my letter, can I ask you a couple of questions on what you just
Please,
presented?
absolutely.
So, this idea of 7 years, and here, forgive me, because I might be conflating the Quranic story with the story in the Torah. But Joseph, in his dream, is 7 years, right? Of feast and famine. Is
Yes,
that not right?
correct.
Is there something about the number seven? Is this a callback to that, or is this seven one of those repeating
Uh,
numbers?
Seven is one of those numbers. It's the 7 days of creation. One of the interesting things about seven is that the seven, the weekly Sabbath, this is the one cycle of time that does not relate to nature, right? The
Hmm.
monthly cycle relates to the cycle of the moon, and the yearly cycle relates to the revolution of the sun, and the daily cycle is the rotation of the earth. But the 7 days is kind of arbitrary, which gives it, I don't know, I guess it gives it a kind of a stamp of the divine prerogative to just choose a number and make
Yeah.
and make it sacred. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And then the last part you were just talking about is that when people buy sell land in the Jubilee year, they're not really buying or selling it. So does that imply that the land is a type of commons? Because you're only buying the produce, and the land is a type of commons that then has to be nurtured. There's a sort of social pressure on that then to maintain the land.
There is, but it's yes, but let me just one little emendation there. It's not buying and selling in the Jubilee year. It's like if you buy it in year 26 of the cycle,
Right.
all you're buying is 24 crop years. You're not buying the land because the land will always go back to its original configuration at the Jubilee year. Now, the complications of exile and coming back, and there are no tribes anymore, it actually kind of messes it up. So we have to think of it as an ideal scheme, which is we ought not be thinking of ourselves as ultimate owners of the land, in which the land is just ours to do whatever we want. It is ultimately God's land, and we are given the right to work it, to profit from it, to do all the capitalist things that we can do, but there are restraints on that, and the Jubilee is one of
Mhm.
the very big ones. And that's just a recurring theme throughout that chapter, which begins with, interestingly, giving the land a rest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that clarification. I think that's a really great segue for me to talk about what I think is the intersection with the letter that I've offered. So, as I mentioned, this is a letter written by the first Shi'i Imam, Ali, the fourth Caliph. He's appointed a new governor to Egypt. He's written this letter on how to rule over Egypt. And the context of this is the governor he's replacing is quite corrupt. So this letter is not only a letter of governance, but it's also a letter on ethics and good behavior. The term we use is akhlaq, of ethics. It's related to the root of creation. So the way I sort of define akhlaq is, because I think ethics is a bit limiting, is to think about akhlaq as what we owe each other because of our belief in the divine. We are creations of the divine, and so therefore we owe each other something through the divine and because of our relationship to the divine. And so I want to start. This isn't on the slide, but if you want to look this up later, this is sort of halfway down page 220 of the full letter. And Imam Ali says, so the first page is a praise of God, and the second page actually begins the governance. And Imam Ali writes to Malik al-Ashtar, infuse your heart with mercy for the subjects, love for them and kindness towards them. Be not like a ravenous beast to prey above them, seeking to devour them. For they are of two types, either your brother in religion or your like in creation. And this, to me, is, I think, really one of the most important frames to understand what is happening in the letter, is that you, as a leader, as somebody who's putative head of this community, do not actually have any control over the people, right? Your job is actually not to control the people. Your job is to be merciful and to love them and exhibit kindness towards them because they are your like in creation. In other words, you have no special status because of this title. You are still human at the end of the day. You're still tied in creation. And Imam Ali continues, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to page 227 and 228. So towards the end of 227, Imam Ali says to Malik, then, oh God, pay particular attention to the lowest class, those who have no wherewithal, the destitute, the needy, the afflicted, the disabled. Within this class are those who beg and those whose wretchedness calls out to be alleviated but do not beg. This is a reference to a Quranic verse 2177. If we have time, I'm happy to go down that rabbit hole because I think it's such a powerful thing, but I want to put that aside. But again, thinking about you as a ruler have to pay attention to those who wouldn't normally have access to you, right? The disempowered, the marginalized. And it continues on 229, and I think this is really worth reading because I find this such a powerful ethical framing before we get into the question of land, because I think the relationship with people is part and parcel. Do not let any haughtiness on your part cause you to neglect them, that is the marginalized people, to neglect them, for you will not be pardoned even in the slightest shortcoming in fulfilling your obligations towards them. As a result of attending some important matter. So no matter what you're doing, no matter what you think is important, if that leads you to neglect the people who are marginalized, who are not otherwise taken care of, then you will not be forgiven for that. There's nothing more important than that. So do not turn your concern away from them, nor assume a contemptuous attitude towards them. Keep a watchful eye over the affairs of those who have no access to you, and those who are disdained by men of high standing. I just find that fascinating. And he continues, apportion a part of your time to those who have special needs, making yourself free to attend to them personally, sitting with them in a public assembly with all due humility before God, your creator. I heard the messenger of God say, God bless him and his family, on more than one occasion. Quote, a nation in which the rights of the weak are not wrested in an uninhibited manner from the strong will never be blessed. And this, to me, this sort of relationship between the strong, the weak, the marginalized, and the elite comes through in this letter repeatedly, consistently. And I think it's a very important context then in which we start thinking about questions of the land. So Ellie, if I could ask you, I don't know if I sent you the clips for the slides in time. If I could ask you to throw up the first slide, please. And continuing this theme about relationships amongst people. It's okay. I will take ownership of the fact that I was quite late getting you the information. So
No, I have them. I just have to.
Okay.
There we go.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Yes, this one. So this begins on page 221, where Imam Ali says, Let the most beloved of affairs to you be the most centered upon the right, the most comprehensive in justice, and the most inclusive of popular contentment. For the discontent of the common folk, al-ama, undermines the contentment of the elite, al-khasa, while the discontent of the elite is compensated by the contentment of the common folk. In times of prosperity, no subject are more of a burden to the ruler as regards to seeking his favor than the elite, and none who are less helpful to him in times of trial, none more repelled than they by justice, more importunate in making demands, less grateful when granted favor, slower to pardon when deprived, less patient in the face of vicissitudes of time. By contrast, the pillar of the religion, the cohesion of the Muslims, and the implement for fighting the enemies are constituted by the common folk. So be well disposed to them and inclined towards them. And I'm just so taken by this, right? Because this feels both very modern, but also really, I think what we're hearing across both our sources is this idea that the vast majority of people should be the people who need to be taken care of. They're the basis of society. They're the laborers. They're the scholars. They're the thinkers. They're not the elite in any meaningful capacity in terms of capital, in terms of time, in terms of leisure. But they're the foundations of society. And when you tend to them, society functions. And when you don't tend to them, society breaks apart. It begins to fail. Because the people who are most elite are the ones who are always the most demanding. That is, this idea of ravenous beasts that I mentioned earlier starts to come forward. That I have so much that I need more. When is more not enough? And I think that is something we keep coming back into. And really what we're trying to look at, or what I'm trying to elucidate here, is the brakes we need to put on the ideas of acquisition. And this is really what this letter is in part coming towards.
Yeah. No, Hussein, my friend and colleague and wonderful scholar, Rabbi Shai Held, has recently been teaching and talking about what he puts it. Who sits at God's table? Who does God invite to God's table? There's a line in the Deuteronomy when it talks in the chapter 16, when it gives the festival calendar of the year, and it gets to the final festival, the most joyous one, when the harvest is fully in. You shall rejoice in your festival with your son and your daughter and your male and female servants, your household. They're at your table, but
Yeah.
also the Levite. The Levite, by the way, you mentioned the scholars and those who are they're the landless ones. They are serving God without any
Mm.
land, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. So there are four people: you, your son and daughter, and your male and female servants. They're at your table. The Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, they're at God's table during the festival, because those are the people that God has to care about the most.
Has to care about the most. Yeah.
Right?
Uh,
There's even a one scholar speculates that this law in the Torah that says if you're harvesting your field and something drops from your hand, you're not supposed to go back and pick it up. You have to leave it for the poor. If you forget to if you forget to harvest an entire row of your crop, you can't go back afterwards. It has to be left for the poor. And this scholar suggested that this is God's. Why did I drop it? This is
right.
God's way of taking care of the poor.
Poor.
Right? Yes.
Right. It's exceptions of the commons. And I think it really runs deep through both our traditions. And speaking of mutual friends, JTS alum and a friend of mine for many years, Jill Jacobs, wrote a wonderful book, There Shall Be No Needy,
Right.
which I think speaks to some of these concerns as well. And full credit to her, she's actually the one who got me started thinking about this from a Muslim perspective.
So you mentioned about capitalism. So there's a duality at the beginning of Jewish scripture. In chapter 1, human beings are told, go dominate the earth, v'kifshua,
Mhm.
subdue it, right? And then in chapter 2, suddenly it's about li'ovda, that same root there again, to serve the land, to work the land, and to preserve the land. And there's a duality there, kind of a tension. Are we given free rein, or do we have these responsibilities? That's kind of an important one. And I wonder if the tension like that, appears in a different guise, or maybe in the guise in Islam.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question. So, um, this question of are we stewards, caretakers of the land, or are we masters, to use the language you used before, right? Are we to dominate the land, or are we to steward it? I think Quranically, the pull is towards stewardship because the idea is that you are taking care of God's creation, and you have an obligation to that creation. And at the same time, there is language of take from the earth what you need. The question is, what is that thing we need, and how do we take from the earth? And as we look at types of mining or oil extraction from the earth, that is taking from the earth, and it is incredibly detrimental, incredibly harmful. And that seems to fly in the face of stewardship and questions of stewardship. So I think these questions are incredibly important. I would argue that the strand has always been there historically. This tension that you pointed has always been there historically. I would think up until about the 18th century or so, it's leaned more into the stewardship because of limited resources, limited travel. So people are familiar with only dealing with what they have and what they have access to. I think after about the 18th century, with travel becoming easier, and colonial agents, and again, I'm not trying to put this on colonialism, but I think it does bring in a different type of worldview that then accelerates the idea of dominionist ideology that we need to dominate on it.
I'm sure you've had the experience of prayers that you may say over and over again, and then suddenly one day a phrase jumps up off the page, and you realize you're hearing it in a way that you hadn't heard it before. I had an experience like that with a prayer that begins the morning prayers every single day of the year in Jewish liturgy. It begins with some benedictions that are directed to God. It begins with "Blessed is the one whose word called the world into being." And it continues for a few lines to acknowledge God's power of creation. And then, quite crucially, it points to another aspect of the divine parallel to the divine power, which is, "Blessed is the one who has compassion for the earth."
Mm.
Then, "Blessed is the one who has compassion for all creatures." And the juxtaposition of those two is really quite striking to me, that compassion for the earth and compassion for the earth's creatures, the creatures that God has brought into the world, are intimately connected. And maybe a little bit of a resolution to that tension in Genesis 1 and 2 that we've both spoken about from our different traditions, that yes, you do actually have to do something with the earth. It was put here with its resources to help humanity, but there has to be some restraint on it because it has to be done with compassion. Yeah.
So I'm the interfering.
You've popped up, yes.
I've popped up. Oh. Hello. There are a couple of kind of clarification questions that I wanted to put out there. One is, what is the date of the letter from Imam Ali to Malik?
Oh, I will come back and give you the exact date, but it would have been the Prophet dies in
632, I think.
632. No? So this is 640-ish.
Okay. And then I noticed this when you said, I think it was your term about binding to ethics took me to the binding of Isaac, which we call the Akedah, that they're similar.
It's not the same root. It's not a shared root. Akhlaq is in Arabic is religion rather than qaida, which is akedah, which is binding or tying together.
Okay, and then the other question about roots were that was the akhla and halacha. Are those the same root?
Hmm.
Gordon, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Halacha, Jewish
law.
It was
halacha seems to come from a root that means a path or a way. I guess the Tao is also the way. So, but it
or Sharia, but not the same root, not a cognitive root. Yeah.
Yep. But it manifests itself in law as it does in Sharia, right?
Okay. But I'm going to now get back to the conversation. I'm sure if you guys have more questions, please send them to me and I'll make sure Gordon and Hussein get them.
Okay, so I promised you a broader look at Leviticus 25. So we're going to
sorry, Gordon, before you continue with Leviticus, can I just follow up on your last comment on this question of compassion?
Yes.
Because I'm really struck by this idea of compassion that you offer in the prayers. This is something that comes up a lot in the letter, which I'm not going to get into, but words of compassion and mercy and compassion. In Arabic, they come from the same root. This is the beginning of every chapter of the Quran but one. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So Rama is the root that's shared. but it's also the root for womb, W-O-M-B, right? And
Correct.
the idea that this is a general, this is something I've been sitting with for a while, not more recently, but as you said, it sometimes hits you, and this has been something that's been hitting with me for a while, is what does it mean that compassion and mercy are related to the womb and the act of creation and generativity that I think that is implied behind that. I'm fascinated by, and I feel like that could be a good side quest for us at some point, just to
Yeah.
think about that generative aspect of it.
Well, Hussein, as you may well know, it's really exactly the same in Hebrew. Blessed is the one who has compassion on the earth, is Baruch mirachem al haaretz,
Mm,
right? Lerachem, we translate as to have compassion, which is a little bit odd in English because compassion means suffering with. I don't know whether we want to think the earth is
right.
actually suffering, but God is suffering when the earth is abused, and is suffering the way a parent who has brought forth a child sees something bad happening to the child. So I think the womb, the rechem, is very much connected to, and interestingly, um, that verb is not generally used for human beings having mercy or compassion on someone else. It's used for God
Okay.
because God is the ultimate womb.
Ultimate mercy and compassion, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, if we could put Leviticus 25 up, because you're probably wondering why in this dry book of Leviticus, I have this crazy idea that it's one of the most important chapters in the Torah. So I'm gonna try to convince you of that in the next couple of minutes. If we can put it up. And again, yeah, oh, good. We've got some stuff. So go to right to the beginning. We're going to scroll through this quickly because I just want to. We're not going to be to read every word of this, but you can even jot down a note and look at it later. There are several things that happen here. Verses 1 through 7 is, as we already began to see, is about the sabbatical year. It's care for God's earth. It actually talks about giving the earth a rest. And in the process, we are acknowledging God's ownership. We can't just work it to death. And then, beginning in verse 8, we have a second section from 8 to 13, which is care that the workings of the free market, which can proceed for half a century at a time, cannot be unlimited. And every 50 years, there has to be a repatriation so that we do not create a permanent underclass, unlanded. Third chunk is in verse 14 through 19, is about commercial transactions that are approved through that half century. They have to be honest. Don't take advantage one of the other. Don't wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, the eternal, am your God, as it says in verse 17. So business ethics, as it were. The next chunk, beginning in verse 25, tells us that the land cannot be sold beyond reclaim. If you sell some of your holding, it will always be subject to repurchase by a member of your clan, so that the repatriation can happen even faster than the Jubilee year, because the idea of someone being displaced from his land is just anathema to the idea of a humane society. Beginning on verse 35, now we have a whole section that is a sequence. A person becomes dependent on your largesse. We saw that in one of the passages that Hussein brought to our attention about people who sometimes have to beg or need loans. They must be cared for. They must not be taken advantage of. And you must not take interest from them, because you wouldn't take interest from your brother or your sister. And everyone in your community is your brother or sister. They have to be treated as such. Now comes verse 39. And we're in a new section where a person finds that he must actually sell his labor to you, not in a free contract, but he becomes an indentured servant, because he needs to be a support of your household in exchange for being at his beck and call. He's not a slave. He's not chattel property, and he has to be treated in a way that preserves his human dignity. And then beginning in verse 47, we have a section where a person may have to sell himself as chattel to a non-Israelite resident. And even that cannot be a permanent sale. The Jubilee is going to repatriate him. And then comes the ultimate sentence in this chapter, verse 55, which is the capstone. It's the summary that underscores the unacceptability for any Israelite that is a member of the covenant with God at Sinai to be in servitude to anyone but to God. It is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants whom I freed from the land of Egypt. So this is, you will see here that there is, and we'll get back to this. I'm going to turn it back to Hussein in a moment, but I want you to keep this in mind, that there are distinct sections in this chapter, but you see, and certainly in that whole last half of it, a descent from needing to sell some of your land, needing to borrow and going into debt, needing to sell your labor, maybe being sold entirely to someone outside the covenantal community, and what that means. And they're going to be. I'm going to suggest. I'm going to present and present an alternative to a way of understanding what that sequencing in this chapter is really about.
Gordon, at the risk of getting ahead of where you're going to be, I'm curious. People are out of Egypt, right? Freedom
Right.
has happened. What does it mean to enter into contracts of indentured servitude or quasi-slavery? How is that sort of still conceptually functioning? I'm sort of taken by that idea that you've had
Oh,
this
yeah.
movement of freedom.
Yeah, it's one of the great dissonances in the book of Exodus, because after the Exodus and then the Mount Sinai experience, and then you get to chapter 21, and you're getting what's called, the scholars refer to as the covenant code. And the very first thing in there is, if you acquire a servant from among the Hebrews, here's how you have to treat them. And they can only work for you for 6 years, and then they have to go free. But why is this happening at all? Well, it's happening at all because I guess people have to eat, and why, what are they going to do if if they are completely destitute? So one of the things that some of this legislation in Leviticus 25 is trying to do is to eliminate the possibility of that, or at least the ubiquity of it, but it will happen.
Mm.
And when it happens, a person will not be able. There is no such thing as chattel slavery among Israelites in the Bible. There is among others, and that's kind of a blot on Scripture. Every Scripture has its blots because it comes from ancient times. But if you confine yourself to the covenantal community, it is not possible to own a human being. Only God owns the human beings. But you can own their labor, and that's a way of keeping them alive. But it's surrounded with a lot of restrictions, and a lot of and a built-in limitation of 6 years. There's a number 7 again, as the
The
time
number
of
7 comes
freedom.
up again. I saw that. And the break, as you
Yeah,
mentioned,
but
in
I agree with
generational
yeah.
servitude.
But I
Yeah.
agree with you. It kind of grates on the ears to be talking about it at all, because we're trying to create a kind of an idealized view of society, and then this hard reality kind of knocks at the door. So yeah.
Thank you, Gordon. Ellie, could I ask you to throw up my slides again? So I did a lot of time in my preface. I'm going to take, although these are longer passages, I'm not going to spend as much time on them, because I think once we got through the ethics component, like what is the moral valence of what this letter is about, then trying to understand what's happening with the question of land tax is very important. So for context, land tax is, as the name suggests, a tax that is produced on the land, right? So this is people farm, they get taxed on what they farmed. This is the thing that starts the revolt of Robin Hood, that people are being overtaxed on their land. So this is the question that's being raised here, and I want to start just sort of about halfway through this first sentence. For it is their welfare, that is of the farmers, and the proper collection of tax itself, that the benefit of others is derived. There can be no of others except through the peasants, for all without exception are dependent on the revenues of the land tax and those subject to it. Um, so therefore, let your concern with the cultivation of the land outweigh your concern for the collection of the tax. For no tax will be collected if there is no cultivation, right? So the idea is that if you are so focused on the tax, that if you're so focused on the revenue that you overextend the land, you've destroyed the land, and therefore you've destroyed your ability to tax. So don't confuse the results with the means, right? Don't confuse the ends with the means. Could I ask you to go to the next slide, Ellie, please? Um, and so if they, that is the peasants, complain of a heavy burden, some deficiency in the land, lack of rain, change of condition of soil, flooding, drought, whatever, then lighten the tax in order to make their situation better. Because if their situation is better, the situation of the land is better and the situation of society is better. This will be an investment which will yield a return for you in terms of the prosperity of the land and adornment of your rule. And then the last slide, please. Um, a prosperous land can bear the burden which you place upon it. The devastation of the land only comes about through the destitution of its inhabitants, and the destitution of its inhabitants only comes about when the desire to amass wealth rules the souls of governors, when they have doubt about what endures, and when they profit little from exemplary teachings. And I just love this, right? There's this phrase in the Quran that comes up a couple of times. The only thing that endures or that persists is the face of God. And so this idea that when governors or rulers have doubts about what endures, they no longer have belief or faith in God. They no longer trust God, that God will provide. And so when you do that, you start taking more and more and more. And you make the people suffer, you make the land suffer. So this ethical component of mercy and compassion therefore extends for the benefit of people to land. There are other letters where Imam Ali is much more clear about taking care of land. But for our purposes, this is sort of what this letter is arguing and saying. So really just trying to highlight that and thinking about what this looks like in a very practical level, and how if you have complete and total trust in God, then you have to take care of God's creation, because God's creation is the investment that will then take care of you. That's how God manifests that. So
Right.
that's all I want to say on the letter at this point.
Okay. Thank you. So, Ellie, if you would put up this section from what's called the Tanhuma and the Buber edition of the Tanhuma, I'll just say a very quick word about that when you put it up. So this is a midrash, which the dating of which is very uncertain, though it's likely that it was just maybe a little bit later than Imam Ali's letter. And it comes in a number of recensions. This is the recension that was kind of discovered and edited by Solomon Buber. That's the grandfather of Martin Buber in the late 19th century. And what it does, as you will see, is it takes Leviticus 25 and it takes very seriously all of that overall arc, all that sequencing that goes on in there. But what it does is it focuses on it from the point of view of what happens to the perpetrator when he violates these rules. So listen to what it says. Shmuel ben Gedaliah said, Rabbi Shmuel ben Gedaliah said, there's no section in the Torah that does not have a capital above and a pedestal below, by which he means that there's always an inclusio. It begins and it ends in a way that creates a whole. How does it begin? Well, speak unto the children of Israel, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, and then the section on the Jubilee. And if one has not observed the sabbatical year in the Jubilee, he will end up selling his movable property. And as the next verse says, when you sell property to your neighbor. If he repents, well and good. But if not, he will end up selling his land when your brother is in straits and has to sell part of his land holding. Well, if he repents from that, that's good. But if not, the next stage comes. He will end up selling his house, if a man sells a dwelling house. If he repents, well and good, but if not, he will end up going around begging from door to door. You're hearing all those different blocks that I pointed out to you now. If your brother being in straits comes under your authority and you maintain him as though a resident alien, if he repents, well and good, but if not, the next stage comes in. He will end up being sold to you. As the verse says, if your brother under you continues in straits and must sell himself to you, if he repents, well and good, but if not, he will end up being sold to the Gentiles. And then at the end it says, nor is it just merely the individual himself who is degraded in this way, but it is both that, sorry, that's a mistake. There is both that person and all of Israel. It affects the entire community. Now, I read this and I said, well, that's very nice, to focus on what are the consequences of sin for the perpetrator. But I was more interested in what is this telling us about what the consequences are for the victims of these violations? What happens to the people who are abused because people are not following the rules? So I just sort of wrote my own alternative to this Tanchuma, which does it like that. And you don't have it up there. You're just going to have to listen to me. How does it begin? It begins the same way. There's a capital above and a pedestal below. But how did it begin? Speak unto the children of Israel, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, and you shall count off 7 Sabbath years. But if one cheats the earth of its well-being, he will end up cheating his neighbor in their transactions. And if he does that with impunity, he will next end up taking over the land of powerless human beings who have become desperate. And inevitably, he will deprive those who lack the resources to resist of their very places of residence. And then those desperate victims will be reduced to begging. And from there, it is a short step to making that person into an indentured servant. For abuse of God's earth will surely in the end lead step by step to abuse of those who inhabit God's earth. Or to paraphrase Heinrich Heine, where the earth is degraded, in the end, people will also be degraded. And that's the grand connection that I see in this most important chapter that I think speaks to what we want to underscore here today.
Thank you, Gordon. I think it's a very powerful reflection. I'll sort of give a closing thought as well, as I know we're approaching time for our Q&A. But one of Imam Ali's descendants, a later Shi'i Imam, Jafar Sadiq, mid 900s, mid 800s, mid 9th century. He writes a book there's a book attributed to him, and he talks about uh, uh, ubudiyah. Ubudiyah is bondage. How are you connected to God? How do you how do you abnegate yourself in front of God? And he says true faith has 4 elements to it. The first is relationship with the divine. The second is relationship with yourself. The third is relationship with humanity, other human beings, and the fourth is with the rest of creation. And that all 4 of these elements have to be in balance in order to be for you to be considered a believer. And I think this is an incredibly powerful reflection, both on the letter that I've offered and Gordon, your reflection, your Tanhuma, which is you don't honor God by disrespecting God's creation. That to honor God's creation is to honor yourself, is to honor God, and that these have to be in a type of virtuous cycle. Otherwise, we enter into an unvirtuous cycle. So I think that's a very powerful way to end.
Yeah. And what makes it possible to abuse the earth is this feeling of mastery, and it's a short step from there to applying that mastery to human beings who are defenseless, and they are the ones who are at God's table. So yes, thank you for all. I loved seeing all these commonalities and resonances between these various texts and the bridge. Yeah.
This is so much fun, and I have so many questions about the Jubilee year, which I'll get to some other time. But
okay.
I think there's probably some time for it. I just juggled the order of people, but I apologize. I've been listening to A People's History of the United States, which I will say does not do much for your optimism in a time of despair. But it does actually reflect that this sense of mass, the questions of, these people who are deeply religious and yet they're all about mastery of the earth. It really is, it's the cognitive dissonance of it is there from the creation of the United States. So so I found this to be a really incredibly profound conversation in light of that particular read. One of our participants wanted to know, in thinking about this, and I think you might both have to frame this together, and I'm not sure if this is, we might come up with a collective answer, but how much of Maimonides' writings about the sabbatical year is influenced by Islamic writings on the subject?
Mm.
So I won't speak to the content. Gordon, I'll defer to you, but
Yeah.
I'm assuming the questioner is obviously aware of Maimonides' background, intellectual milieu, was very much in a Muslim Neoplatonic background. And at least what I've read of Maimonides, I think the parallels are very strong as he leaves the Iberian Peninsula. I actually think it becomes sharper. Those connections become sharper and more pointed. Not knowing enough about Maimonides specifically on creation, I'm going to throw my hands up, but in terms of historical context, that there would be some relationship does not surprise me.
Well, Maimonides on the sabbatical year is primarily in his code of law, where he is, in influence uh, from the Arabic philosophy. Um, I think would be very, very hard to discern because it may well be there, but what he's essentially doing is digesting a lot of things that are in the Talmud from, almost 1,000 years before him. He's probably the most prolific codifier of law in the Middle Ages. The Talmud wasn't really about law; it's a source of law, but it was about dialogue. In the Middle Ages, we begin to get codifications, and Maimonides puts out the most comprehensive one. Um, he may talk about the sabbatical year. He probably does. I'm just not remembering it now in his philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed. But frankly, I would have to go and look that up because I don't remember that chapter of what he says there. And that might well show some influence from his Islamic milieu. But you wouldn't find that in his code of law, certainly not explicitly.
I also find the question of influence, at least amongst Muslims and Jews, interesting because there are so many. Um, we're drawn from the same sources, basically, right? I mean, obviously, the Quran doesn't play a role in Jewish thought in the way it does for us, and the Tanakh plays a different role for Muslims. But conceptions of the divine are very similar. How law develops, the processes, and there's a lot of parallels. So I think influence is a really interesting question, which is why I was more interested in the Neoplatonic element and what Muslims are doing with Neoplatonism, because that's where the intervention is, perhaps more than the content, because I think there are parallels that we keep seeing over and over again. And we see this in early Muslim history, for example, when there's a question that we're not quite clear on, like thinkers will go to Jewish antecedents because of these strong parallels.
Mhm. And you do get echoes. I mean, I myself, not being a scholar of that period, but I myself have seen some echoes of, this or that hadith in
Mhm.
Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages. Bachya ibn Pakuda in the 11th century is an example of that. So these things were known and were freely used when they were useful, when they
Yeah.
made the point that people wanted to make.
I think that idea of cross-pollination, when for many of us, when we picture medieval society, you're picturing very distinct, separate universes where there are all of these, and to understand that there's this kind of porous interaction that's not just about, oh, here is, the porous interaction of commerce, but actually of ideas as well, is fascinating. That we feel like in the last 200 years, this is when ideas have started circulating, and really this has always been part of it, a kind of a global structure, um, which in some ways is reassuring that we can find ways to. And as one of our commentators said, we are all so much more alike than different. And the more I learn about other beliefs, the more similarities there are. And I think that it's there is something so reassuring in that message that we can find these similar that there is more than just what makes us distinct. There wasn't really a question there, but you feel free to comment.
Well, it does make some sense to me that different approaches to doing right will tend to converge, right? There are going to be a million ways to do wrong, but it does make sense to my mind and my sensibility that if everyone is aiming at doing the right thing, they're likely to be converging on similar paths.
Do you have a sense between, in this moment where we are overtaxing our land in so many ways, of how, and knowing that the idea of enforcing a jubilee is basically not a possibility, of how maybe we could get there. Who's to say? What would you say? What are the ways in which we as individuals, as people in religious communities, can work towards a space in which we are more in partnership with land as opposed to mastery over land?
Look, there's a lot of wisdom in the aphorism, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And yes, of course, the Jubilee as it's set forth in a very different kind of time, in a more compressed kind of time, in an entirely agricultural time, is unworkable today in the way it's set forth in the Bible. But if we try to figure out what they were trying to do, and this is about certain kinds of restraint, this is about certain kinds of seeing the realities of society and being able to be compassionate. And here I use, the actual, the meaning of that English word of being able to share somewhat in the suffering and the degradation of people who are degraded. And Lord knows, I mean, we're dealing with that in our country right now, not in the rest of the world. If we can take that from the Jubilee, we don't have to be implementing it exactly as the Torah is set forth. But if that pervades some of the hearts and minds of the general populace, but particularly those who the populace chooses as their leaders, it'll be a very different world.
Yeah. I think that when I read, as somebody outside the Jewish tradition, but when I read Leviticus, when I read about the Jubilee, or when I read about Sabbath years, for me, it's not so much about the literalism of the Sabbath, as much as I would love to get every 7 years off. Don't get me wrong, right? That's part of the reason I became an academic. But is really to think about what is the commitments we're trying to create. And what would it take for us to make, in the context of the United States, for example, let's say, to say that every 7 years, people have to commit. We can create social structures that allow people to commit to doing something for a common good. Maybe 7 years old is too young, but maybe not. But 14, 21, right? Instead of doing the gap year, 21 is your gap year, right? So even if you're in college or you're not in college, but 21, your third multiple of 7, you've got to do something where we enable you to go and teach, to work the land, to do cleanup, to do rebuilding the levees in New Orleans. Like the public infrastructure, what would it take to do a works public administration as part of our national service, as part of our national identity, right? That to me is what the value of a call to the Sabbath year is to me, sitting outside the tradition, is how do we achieve that same end? How do we achieve that commitment to one another? How do we achieve that commitment to both physical, mental, spiritual well-being, in ways that we can structure non-religiously, but still get that deep personal growth, or partner with those who want to prepare. But I think that to me is the call, right?
Yeah.
And there's learning from each of our traditions, and I really want to call out. There's a lot of traditional knowledge that we've lost over the years as we've tried to industrialize, that I think is very important for us to consider, and not forget indigenous knowledges wherever we are in the world, right? I was reading an article recently that in Australia, which has been dealing with a lot of bushfires as global climate change has increased, that they keep doing, for years, decades, they've been trying, traditional firefighting methods that are like, nope, let's just go to the indigenous keepers of the land and figure out how they managed to do it for 20,000 years instead of our last 200. And they're like, oh, this actually works a lot better. And let's also go back that people who live with the land, and I think this is what the letter was at, the people who live with the land know the land best. So let's try to give them respect and do it for their expertise.
Yeah, Hussein, I love your idea about the vision of the sabbatical year, whether it's 7 or 14 or whatever it is. Absolutely, and it's related to something else that I wondered about. Again, after knowing about this for many years, it suddenly occurred to me what were people doing during that sabbatical year in biblical times? If they told you can't work the land, and that's all they were doing because it was an agricultural society, so what were they doing? It doesn't tell us that anyone went crazy out of boredom. They must have been doing something. What would happen today if, we know what happens when people lose their passwords or lose their keys and can't get into their office. They go out of their minds. Because who are you besides your work? What is your soul in addition to what you do I was about to say from 9 to 5, but part of the malady of society is it's 9 to 5 a.m. now, not to 5 p.m. So that's a question that it gets answered when one has to plan for what am I going to do for public service? What really matters to me? What's the part of society that I'm going to try to devote myself to for the greater good? That will tell you something about yourself.
I would also add on to that, to your point about us being alienated from ourselves. What do we do besides work? I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, putting that out there in the public. And I read this wonderful article, and I can't remember who wrote it. If anybody knows the article I'm talking about, please feel free to give credit. But the person who wrote the article said, "Why is there so much mediocre art in Star Trek? It's because people have the time to create, and people create like when you get rid of their material, their struggle for material needs, people then want to create. It's in our nature. We want to draw, we want to paint, we want to write, we want to sing, we want to do plays. And when you have the time to do that, then you're putting something out in the world that somebody needs or finds attractive, right? We're so conditioned to art as being the thing we see on the walls in museums that we forget it's the thing that our neighbor is doing, and it's just equally as beautiful, even if it's not prized by that system that makes us work 9 a.m. to 5 a.m.
At the risk of taking us on a little tiny tangent, what you just said reminded me of something. There's a little book that Elaine Scarry wrote some years ago on beauty. And one of the points she makes there is when people see something beautiful, they are moved to try to reproduce it.
Hmm.
You see the beauty of the world, you want to draw it. You want to sing it, or you want to do
Yep.
some artistic way of duplicating it and when you see a beautiful human being that you want to partner with, that's part of the urge to have children, to reproduce, the beauty of the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I found the article. It's "We Need More Bad Art and I'm Willing to Do My Part," maybe by Scott Laird.
Oh, that doesn't sound familiar, but I will be happy to
That's
take a look.
good.
Maybe. But I think there is something, and I think in that there is definitely a responsiveness right now in terms of the world of craft that, a lot of people, as a way of divorcing themselves from screens, are finding ways of doing kind of more traditional handicraft type things
Yeah.
because this is, and in that way that it doesn't need to be and necessarily a work of genius. It just needs to be something that's yours.
Yeah.
And we all could use more of things that are ours without having to own them in the same way.
I will, to that point, I will tell you, Gordon and I share a student. I'm teaching a course on the Quran this semester that our shared student is in. Um, and in this course on the Quran, I've really decided to focus on materiality of the Quran, like what is the physical thing of the Quran, is the content. And so I had them actually go and make a book. So they understood what was involved in making a book. They had to marble the paper. They had to sew the book together. We have a design center on campus, so we had professional instruction. They weren't left to their own devices. But thinking about, we really had a great conversation about what does it mean to go buy a book, to go to your bookstore and buy a book where everything is done and made for you, or to buy your journal, your Mujo, your Moleskine, or whatever it is. I'm not advertising. I'm just, brand name recognition. versus trying to make it yourself, and what value does it add? And the way students across the board are talking about, I've never had something that I felt, so I've never had a book that I felt so attached to, where like I'm carrying it around in Ziploc bags, one student told me, because it's so precious to me. And I'm like, but this is the thing, is you don't know what you're capable of. We don't think about the materiality and the ability to create, right? The last time some of these kids played with white, I shouldn't say kids, these students played with white glue was they literally, somebody said, in elementary school. And I'm like, what are you creating? How do you put beauty in the world? And I think giving people that opportunity is so important right now for so many reasons, because it does allow us to slow down and think. Not that technology is bad, but if you don't appreciate what technology has allowed you to do, you don't understand what it is you've lost, right?
Mm.
I no longer have to bind my own books or pay exorbitant amounts for those books. That should free me up to read more books, not to work more, right? Like we've lost that conception of what that time was meant to free up.
Yeah. And of course, there are traditions of beautiful calligraphy in both the Jewish and Arabic traditions. I saw some amazing Arabic calligraphy in China, of all places, years ago. It was stunning, absolutely stunning. You just kind of stared at it. But all of this, idea of beauty and creating beauty brings us back to the importance of honoring and standing in awe of the beauty of creation and the creatures in creation, and how that dignity is has to be central to any kind of humane life.
Thank you both so much for your time and your knowledge, and just it's been great. I selfishly have gotten to be witness to several conversations about this conversation, so it has been a joy throughout. Next week we are finishing this series by exploring Passover, and we're going to be looking at the anxiety around bondage and our bondage to stuff, which actually I think fits with what we have been talking about today as well. So thank you guys for feeding into next week's program with Laura Bello from Dayenu and rabbinical student Joe Blumberg. We'll be back, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Thank you again, Gordon and
Thank
Hussein.
you. As
Thank
always,
you all so much.
a pleasure to be with both of you, as always. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.